Hey, did you know that more than 90% of our viewers listen every night but haven't subscribed yet? If you enjoy these gangster sleep stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. It's completely free and helps us keep these underworld tales alive. Now, get comfortable, unwind, and drift into tonight's story. The night settles softly over the silent empires, where power moves in shadows and reputations are carved in silence. Tonight, we turn to Umberto Anastasia, a man whose fierce ambition and unshakable presence made him one of the most feared figures in America's underworld. His world was built on quiet decisions, sharp instincts, and a legacy forged in the darkest corners of organized crime. Before we begin, tap that like button. We're aiming for 100 likes tonight, and share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. Your support keeps these whispered stories alive in the calm of the night. Now settle back, let the world slow down, and allow the story of Umberto Anastasia to guide you deeper into the silence. On a gray October afternoon in 1957, a heavy-set man in an expensive suit stepped into the barber shop of the Park Sheraton Hotel in Midtown Manhattan. He was no stranger to luxury. Silk tie, polished shoes, pinky ring that caught the light when he moved his hand. To anyone watching, he looked like a successful businessman stopping in for a trim before dinner. The barber greeted him by name, draped a white cloth over his chest, and tilted the chair back. Outside, Midtown traffic hummed, cabs honked, people hurried past the revolving doors. Inside, the room smelled of talc and hair tonic. Radio music played softly, scissors clicked. The man glanced once at the mirror, at the reflection he had spent a lifetime building, calm, confident, sure of his place in the city. Behind that calm face was a history of dockyards, secret meetings, whispered orders, and a long trail of fear. He had risen from a poor coastal town in southern Italy to the very top of organized crime in America. Police officers, prosecutors, union leaders, even other underworld figures spoke his name with caution. On paper, he was Umberto Anastasia, a naturalized American citizen, respected by some, hated by many, watched by federal agents. To most people in the life, he was something else. A man whose anger could be deadly, whose favor could change fortunes. As the barber worked, as the chair turned slightly, as the cloth fluttered against his chest, two figures moved quietly down the hallway outside. A few seconds later, the calm music, the sound of scissors, the city noise from the street all crashed into a moment that would end one of the most feared careers in American crime. What happened in that barbershop became front-page news across the country. Yet the story of how that man arrived in that chair took decades to unfold, beginning far away, in a world of poverty and limited chances, long before New York knew his name. He was born Umberto Anastasio on the 26th of September 1902, in the coastal town of Tropea, in Calabria, the rugged toe of Italy's boot. His father worked for the railways, a hard job for modest pay. The family was large, more than 10 children, all crammed into a modest home near the sea. In that part of Italy, life at the turn of the century meant long days, few opportunities, and almost no safety net. Drought, sickness, and sheer bad luck could ruin a family. Umberto did not enjoy a long education. Like many boys around him, he left school early and spent his childhood helping the family however he could. People who later looked back at his early years described him as strong for his age, quick to lose his temper, and unwilling to be pushed around. In a region where arguments sometimes turned harsh, he learned very young that weakness could be dangerous. The early decades of the 20th century were years of massive migration from southern Italy to North America. Letters went back across the ocean, telling stories of better pay, modern cities, streets full of chances. For many, that dream meant the difference between staying in a village with no prospects and taking a risky journey across the sea. Several of Umberto's brothers left for the United States before him, chasing that possibility. In 1919, as a teenager, he followed. Official records and later reports differ on details, but the broad outline is clear. He crossed the Atlantic on a ship heading for New York, and did not enter the country through the usual legal process. Some accounts say he worked as a sailor and deserted his post in port. Others suggest he slipped into the United States without inspection. Either way, immigration authorities soon caught him. Instead of a welcoming ceremony, his first experience in America involved arrest, court appearances, and confinement. He received a prison sentence for violating immigration laws. It was a harsh start in a new land. Locked away in a country where he barely spoke the language, surrounded by strangers, he learned quickly how unforgiving American systems could be to an unconnected young man from Calabria. Yet prison also hardened him, sharpened his sense of survival, and brought him into contact with men who lived by breaking rules. After serving part of his sentence, he was paroled into the care of one of his brothers living in Brooklyn. He also changed his surname, dropping the final O, and becoming Umberto Anastasia. Brooklyn in the early 1920s had large Italian neighborhoods, crowded tenements, and a waterfront that ran on sweat, muscle, and quiet threats. The docks were places where crates disappeared, goods were skimmed, and payoffs changed hands. Unions and gang figures fought for control. Employers looked the other way as long as ships were loaded, and many families relied on that chaotic world for income. Umberto found work as a longshoreman, hauling cargo, learning the rhythms of the waterfront. The job was brutal. Long hours, cold winters, humid summers, sudden accidents. Men with quick hands, strong backs, and a willingness to follow the unwritten rules of the pier could rise in influence. On those docks, physical courage and a readiness to confront rivals mattered as much as skill. Within a short time, his name was known on the piers. He was tough, direct, and unwilling to back down. That combination attracted attention from established criminal networks that already had interests in the harbor. During Prohibition, which began in 1920, smuggling alcohol and other contraband through ports became an immensely profitable activity. The docks were a natural entry point. Longshoremen who cooperated could benefit. Those who resisted risked their jobs or their safety. In 1921, while still in his early 20s, Umberto faced the most serious legal crisis of his life up to that point. He was arrested and charged with the killing of another dock worker during a dispute on the waterfront. Contemporary reports describe the conflict as related to power struggles over jobs and control. Whatever the precise cause, prosecutors believed he had committed deliberate, cold-blooded violence. A jury agreed. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to die in the electric chair. For a young immigrant who had barely begun his life in America, the sentence was crushing. Yet the case did not end there. His lawyers launched appeals that attacked the reliability of the witnesses and questioned procedures in the trial. In a justice system already struggling with corruption and intimidation, witnesses in gang-related cases often faced enormous pressure. Over time, key people who had testified against him either changed their accounts, refused to repeat their earlier statements, or could not be located. As the legal process dragged on, the case against him weakened. Finally, after multiple reversals and delays, prosecutors dropped the charges. He walked out of custody a free man. Newspapers of the time remarked on how unusual it was for someone to go from a death sentence to release, hinting at the power of underworld influence. Law enforcement officers suspected that threats and quiet deals had played a role in unraveling the prosecution. They had no solid proof they could present in court, but the outcome sent a clear message. This was someone whose friends and allies could reach deep into the system. That escape from execution became a turning point. Among criminals, it significantly raised his status. Anyone who could beat a death sentence in such a serious case was seen as formidable. On the docks, his reputation as an enforcer grew. Men followed his directions, partly out of respect, partly out of fear. Businesses that relied on the harbor learned that negotiations over labor issues increasingly involved him, directly or indirectly. Prohibition continued to fuel illegal markets. Smuggling liquor from Canada and overseas, running speakeasies, guarding shipments, collecting payments from bar owners and distributors. These activities required organized groups capable of handling disputes and protecting operations. Italian, Jewish, and Irish gangs carved out territories across New York City. In this crowded, competitive underworld, alliances mattered. Umberto gradually connected with more influential figures, including the circle around Charles "Lucky" Luciano, who would later become a central architect of modern American organized crime. By the mid-1920s, Luciano and his close associates, men like Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, and Joe Adonis, saw value in someone like Anastasia. He combined brute strength with a growing understanding of how power worked in New York. He knew the waterfront. He had already shown he could survive a serious court case, and he did not hesitate when orders came down. Law, Enforcement agents and mob informants later described him as a man ready to carry out violent tasks without asking many questions. Whether every accusation was accurate or not, the pattern was clear. His name appeared repeatedly in investigations of unsolved attacks tied to labor disputes and gang conflicts. Police arrested him numerous times during these years on suspicion of involvement in acts of violence, intimidation, and union racketeering. Yet charges were often reduced or dropped. Witnesses became reluctant, cases stalled, or evidence proved insufficient. Detectives grew frustrated as they watched a man they believed to be deeply involved in serious crime walk out of station houses again and again. In reports, they started calling him one of the most dangerous figures on the waterfront, even though officially he was just another longshoreman, and later a union official. Inside the Italian-American underworld, an older generation still held formal power. Bosses like Giuseppe, Joe the Boss, Masseria, and Salvatore Maranzano tried to run things in the old Sicilian way, with strict hierarchies and regional loyalties. Younger men, including Luciano and his allies, preferred a more business-like approach, open to working across ethnic lines if it meant more profit and less pointless bloodshed. Tension between these visions simmered throughout the late 1920s. When the conflict finally exploded into open war around 1930, Anastasia was drawn into it along with many others. The struggle became known as the Castellamarese War, named after a Sicilian town because many of Maranzano's followers came from that region. On one side stood Masseria, the established New York boss who claimed tribute from many smaller groups. On the other stood Maranzano, whose faction believed Masseria was greedy and outdated. Young gangsters had to choose. Most accounts place Anastasia in Masseria's camp at the outset, tied through his connections on the Brooklyn docks and his association with emerging figures around him. The war brought kidnappings, ambushes, and a climate of constant suspicion. Men avoided open streets, changed their routines, watched for shadows behind them. Each side tried to eliminate the other's strongest supporters. For law enforcement, the outbreak of violence confirmed what they had suspected. The city's Italian gangs were not loose, random hoodlums, but organized factions with national and even international ties. Federal agencies began paying closer attention. Yet despite growing interest from authorities, very few participants faced serious convictions at that time. Fear, lack of witnesses, and limited investigative tools kept many crimes unsolved. Throughout this tense period, Anastasia's role in the dockyards remained crucial. Control of the harbor meant control of a vital artery for smuggling and extortion. Men loyal to him ensured that cargo could move or be slowed, that strikes could start or end, depending on what the underworld leadership wanted. This economic leverage made him valuable to whichever side expected to come out on top. As the war dragged on, Luciano made a fateful decision. Seeing both Masseria and Maranzano as obstacles to a more stable, profitable structure, he quietly plotted to remove each of them. He reached out to trusted associates who could be relied on in dangerous moments. Later, accounts from informants and investigators often place Anastasia among the hard men counted on when deadly tasks required reliable hands. Officials believed he helped enforce Luciano's plans during this transition period, though the exact details remain the subject of debate and conflicting testimony. By the time the smoke of the Castellamarese War began to clear in 1931, New York's criminal landscape was changing. The old-style bosses were gone, replaced by a more modern framework known later as the Commission, in which major families coordinated policy and settled disputes. In that new order, Anastasia would rise even higher, benefiting from his loyalty to Luciano's circle and his control over labor on the busy Brooklyn waterfront. The path he had taken from a poor boy in Tropea to a feared figure in New York's hidden power structure had already left deep marks on the city, even though most residents still had no idea who he was. In the summer of 1931, New York's underworld felt strangely quiet. Two old bosses were gone. The shooting war that had frightened even hardened gangsters had calmed, and a new kind of order was slowly taking shape. In back rooms of restaurants and clubhouses, men who had survived the chaos sat down to design rules meant to keep future battles from spiraling out of control. They were not interested in peace for its own sake. They wanted stability, steady profits, and a way to settle disputes without constant war. At the center of this reorganization stood Charles "Lucky" Luciano. He pushed for a structure that treated crime like a nationwide business. Instead of one boss of bosses demanding homage from every city, he proposed a council of major family leaders. That body, later known as the Commission, would act as a board of directors, with representatives from New York's main Italian groups and powerful organizations in other regions. It was an attempt to modernize an old-world system. Within this design, individual families controlled territories and industries, but answered to shared rules. Each family had a boss, an underboss, and a consigliere, along with captains who supervised specific crews. It was a hierarchy, but one meant to reduce random violence. Luciano's allies, those who had supported his vision during the rough years of the Castellamarese War, were rewarded with key positions. Among them was Umberto Anastasia, now moving firmly into the upper levels of organized crime. The family that mattered most to his next chapter was led by Vincent Mangano, a traditionalist from an earlier era, who nonetheless accepted Luciano's plan. Mangano's group, operating mainly in Brooklyn and parts of Manhattan, had deep roots along the waterfront. Docks, warehouses, trucking firms, and the Longshoremen's Union fell squarely within its reach. For someone like Anastasia, who already commanded respect on the piers, this was a natural fit. Mangano recognized both the value and the danger of a man like him. On one hand, Anastasia could enforce decisions, discipline unruly members, and keep labor in line. On the other, his fierce temper and independent streak posed a constant risk. Despite these concerns, or perhaps because of them, Mangano relied heavily on him. Over time, Anastasia rose to the position of underboss in the Mangano family, effectively second in command, with special authority over the waterfront and related rackets. On the docks, power flowed through a mix of union rules, unwritten agreements, and quiet pressure. Longshoremen needed jobs in a world where work was handed out each morning at the hiring halls. It was easy for corrupt officials to favor some men and freeze out others. Gang figures used that leverage to demand payments from workers and companies alike. Shipping lines paid labor peace money to ensure cargo moved without sudden strikes. Rank-and-file workers often had to hand over a portion of their pay in exchange for steady assignments. Anastasia excelled in this environment. He understood that fear, once established, did half the work. People knew his record, knew the stories about the murder case he had beaten, heard whispers about what might happen to those who crossed him. Even without visible displays of force, that reputation alone pushed many into line. Employers signed deals they didn't like. Union officers followed his wishes. Dock workers kept their complaints quiet. While he tightened control of the Brooklyn waterfront, a broader criminal alliance took shape at the national level. Luciano and his partners built ties to Jewish and Irish organizations, blending talents and territories. Out of this mix grew an enforcement arm, whose name would later dominate headlines, a group informally called Murder, Incorporated. The exact origins of this unit are still debated, but by the mid-1930s, it functioned as a pool of contract killers, available to syndicate leaders across the country. Day-to-day management of this deadly service fell largely to Louis Lepke Buchalter, a powerful racketeer, and a cluster of Brooklyn hitmen from neighborhoods like Brownsville. They were tough, anonymous figures who lived modestly and worked under strict instructions. The link between this crew and the Commission ran in significant part through Anastasia. Law enforcement and later witnesses painted him as the senior Italian liaison, the man who helped translate high-level decisions into specific assignments. He did not sit in smoky rooms choosing random victims. The system was more formal. When the Commission wanted to eliminate someone judged to be a threat, a suspected informer, a rival who ignored warnings, or a partner who had stolen too much, it could call on this enforcement unit. Through intermediaries, information about the target would reach Buchalter's crew, who then planned and executed the task in whatever city or neighborhood was involved. Payments and instructions moved discreetly, often through middlemen, to shield those at the top. Over time, newspapers, prosecutors, and even some criminals took to calling Anastasia the Lord High Executioner, or the Mad Hatter, nicknames meant to capture his supposed enthusiasm for violence. How much of that image reflected reality, and how much grew from fear and rumor, is hard to untangle. He almost certainly did not oversee every act later attributed to Murder, Incorporated, but evidence suggests he helped maintain its authority and acted as a protector for those who carried out its work. The 1,930 seconds brought several highly publicized gangland killings that investigators later linked, directly or indirectly, to the syndicate's enforcement system. One of the most famous involved Dutch Schultz, a volatile bootlegger who wanted to eliminate New York prosecutor Thomas Dewey, then building a reputation by targeting organized crime. Luciano and other leaders considered attacking a prominent public official too risky. When Schultz refused to drop his plan, the commission decided he had become a liability. In 1935, Schultz and several associates were shot in a Newark restaurant. Law enforcement later pointed to Murder, Incorporated, as the likely source of the gunman, though firm courtroom proof tying specific commission members to the decision never fully emerged. Crimes like this deepened the aura around men like Anastasia. To detectives reading through surveillance reports and informant statements, he looked like a central figure in a tightly connected web. They suspected him in case after case, not as the person who pulled the trigger on street corners, but as one of the men who approved who lived and who died. Yet for all their suspicions, they struggled to make charges stick. Witnesses feared retaliation. Those who might talk often had long criminal records of their own, making them easy to discredit at trial. Still, cracks began to appear. In the late 1930 seconds, some members of Murder, Incorporated, grew careless. They boasted in bars, flashed new money, or drew attention through petty disputes. Detectives in Brooklyn, alarmed at a pattern of unsolved killings, increased pressure. They picked up small-time gunmen, leaned on bookies, and slowly pieced together connections between seemingly unrelated cases. Out of that effort, one name emerged that would change everything: Abraham Abe Reles. Reles was a tough street enforcer from Brownsville who had long worked with the Murder Incorporated crew. By 1940, facing his own serious charges and fearing the electric chair, he chose cooperation over loyalty. Under heavy guard, he began talking to prosecutors, supplying a detailed account of the syndicate's enforcement operations. He described how assignments arrived from higher levels, how he and his colleagues tracked targets, and how they divided payments. His information tied specific individuals to specific crimes, giving law enforcement what it had lacked for years: a guided tour through the Underworld's Black Book. Based largely on Reles's testimony, authorities launched a sweeping crackdown. Many of the Brownsville hitmen were arrested, charged, and eventually convicted. Several received death sentences. Louis Lepke Buchalter himself was tried in federal court on unrelated labor racketeering charges and later executed in New York State for ordering the killing of a candy store owner. Newspapers and radio programs followed every twist, treating the story like a real-life crime novel. In his statements, Reles also mentioned the man on the Italian side of the line, Anastasia. He painted him as a feared overseer, a man whose approval was required before certain jobs went forward. Someone the entire Murder Incorporated crew treated with deep caution. These claims immediately caught the attention of investigators who had long suspected the same thing. Grand juries heard a flood of new evidence. Prosecutors prepared indictments not only against street killers, but also against those they believed had ordered or authorized the crimes. In 1941, Anastasia found himself formally charged in connection with one of these cases. The precise incident involved the disappearance and presumed murder of an Underworld associate whom Reles claimed had been targeted for disloyalty. According to prosecution theory, the order had traveled up the chain to Anastasia, who used his authority to grant approval. For the first time since his waterfront murder conviction 2 decades earlier, he faced the real possibility of a long prison term or worse. He responded with his usual calm. As before, his defense team attacked the credibility of the state's star witnesses. They pointed out that Reles and others had much to gain by shifting blame upward. Men already facing death sentences had every reason, they argued, to embroider stories, exaggerate roles, or invent conversations to please prosecutors. Without direct physical evidence, they insisted, it was unsafe to convict on the word of such individuals. While lawyers battled in court, events outside the courtroom shifted the ground again. On the 12th of November 1941, Abe Reles, under heavy guard in a hotel room in Coney Island, plunged to his death from a window. Police had been keeping him there instead of in a regular jail, believing it easier to protect him from reprisals. Early that morning, guards claimed they awoke to find the room empty and the window open. Below, on an extension roof several stories down, lay Reles's body. Official accounts labeled it either an escape attempt gone wrong or a desperate man's final act of despair. However, the location of the window, the presence of multiple guards, and the high stakes involved fueled immediate speculation. Many suspected that underworld figures, desperate to silence the key witness in the murder, incorporated cases, had somehow reached inside the protective circle. Others believed the guards themselves might have been bribed or coerced. No conclusive proof ever emerged, and no one was convicted in connection with Reles's death. For the public and for many investigators, though, the incident became a symbol of how far criminal influence could extend. For Anastasia, the effect was dramatic. Without Reles available to repeat his statements under cross-examination, the foundation of several cases weakened. Prosecutors struggled to present the same story with secondary witnesses. Judges, wary of overturning legal safeguards, proved reluctant to rely solely on hearsay accounts of what Reles had supposedly said. One by one, the most serious charges against Anastasia were dismissed or allowed to expire. Once again, he walked away from a confrontation with the law at a moment when many believed he would finally be held fully accountable. The pattern reinforced his dark legend. To people watching from the outside, it seemed almost uncanny. Witness after witness recanted, disappeared, or, in Reles's case, died in sudden, mysterious fashion. In truth, some of this reflected the difficult reality of prosecuting organized crime in that era. Police lacked modern forensic tools, audio recordings were rare, and many potential witnesses had criminal records that damaged their value in front of juries. But the coincidences were hard to ignore. By the early 1942s, murder, incorporated as a formal group, lay in ruins. Many of its street gunmen were dead or imprisoned. Lepke Buchalter's conviction sent a chill through labor racketeers who had once felt untouchable. Yet the death of the enforcement unit did not end the power of those who had used it. The commission still existed. The New York families still controlled unions, gambling, loan sharking, and other rackets. And Anastasia, despite intense scrutiny, retained his position as underboss of the Mangano family and master of the Brooklyn waterfront. The world outside the underworld was changing too. Europe was at war. In December 1941, just weeks after Reles's fatal fall, the United States entered World War II following the attack on Pearl Harbor. Government attention, resources, and public concern shifted sharply from domestic crime to global conflict. For men like Anastasia, this shift presented both risks and opportunities. Years of illegal entry issues and earlier convictions still hung over him. Technically, he remained vulnerable to deportation because of his original unlawful arrival in the United States and his old death sentence, even though it had been overturned. Immigration authorities and federal prosecutors could, at least in theory, reopen those questions. At the same time, his control over the docks gave him potential leverage. The American war effort depended heavily on safe, efficient ports to move cargo, troops, and supplies. Rumors of sabotage and foreign agents made waterfront security a national concern. Against this backdrop, relationships between certain underworld figures and parts of the United States government quietly shifted. Officials from naval intelligence and other agencies, worried about strikes and potential enemy interference at the docks, sought ways to ensure cooperation from unions and local power brokers. Men connected to Luciano, and through him to Anastasia, presented themselves as uniquely able to guarantee that ships would sail on time, free from labor disruptions or hostile acts. Stories later circulated that Anastasia, among others, cooperated with federal authorities to secure New York's harbor during the war. Some of these accounts are difficult to verify fully, colored by self-serving claims and the desire of various people to appear more patriotic than their pasts might suggest. Still, enough documentation exists to support the resting, broader picture. The government, facing unprecedented global threats, made quiet understandings with certain underworld figures in exchange for help keeping the docks stable. For Anastasia, wartime also marked the start of another transformation, a move toward legal recognition in the country he had once entered in chains. Over the next few years, he would take steps to secure American citizenship, adopt a more conventional first name, and blend his illicit power base with more visible signs of middle-class success. But beneath the new respectability, the same old currents ran. Fear on the waterfront, unsolved killings, and a reputation that made his very presence in a room feel like a threat. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, harbor lights dimmed at night, troop ships crowded the piers, and the waterfront suddenly looked less like a local racket and more like a front line. Navy officers worried about sabotage, foreign agents, and strikes that might slow supply ships headed overseas. New York's docks were a vital link, and everyone knew they were also deeply influenced by people like Umberto Anastasia. At the same time, his own position was not entirely secure. Old immigration issues still hung over him. He had once been an illegal entrant, had been sentenced to death for a waterfront killing, and only escaped that fate through a series of legal reversals. Deportation remained a weapon the government could use if it chose. Facing that risk, he took a step few would have expected from a man with his past. In 1942, he entered the United States Army. The move served several purposes at once. It showed apparent loyalty to his adopted country at a moment of crisis. It placed him, at least on paper, on the same side as the institutions that had spent years trying to imprison him, and it offered a practical path toward full citizenship, something he had never previously possessed. His service was not dramatic. He did not ship out to foreign battlefields or lead troops in combat. Instead, he was assigned to domestic posts, including training bases such as Fort Dix in New Jersey. Records show that he performed routine duties, the kind of tasks thousands of other soldiers did inside the country. Maintenance, support work, small-scale responsibilities that kept the massive military machine running. To the men around him, he appeared as another older recruit, already in his 40s, doing his bit. While he wore a uniform, a very different side of his life continued to function on the docks. Associates still loyal to him supervised the longshoremen, negotiated with shipping lines, and collected payments. The war increased the value of their position. Military cargoes arrived under government contract. Supplies heading for Europe and the Pacific filled the holds of ships. Any interference could become more than a private nuisance. It might be seen as sabotage. It was in this climate that quiet contacts grew between certain figures in organized crime and officials in naval intelligence. The best-known part of this story centers on Lucky Luciano, who was approached while in prison and later helped, indirectly, to secure cooperation along the waterfront. Through Luciano's circle, links extended to others, including Anastasia. Historians still argue over the exact details, but the broad picture is widely accepted. In exchange for assurances that the docks would remain free of strikes and hostile activity, the government softened its approach toward some underworld leaders. For Anastasia, the war period ended with something he had lacked ever since stepping illegally off a ship decades earlier: legal recognition as an American. In 1943, while still in uniform, he was granted United States citizenship. At that time, he formally adopted a more American-sounding first name. Umberto became Albert. From that point forward, in court documents, newspapers, and police files, he appeared as Albert Anastasia. The citizenship papers did not erase his past, but they changed his legal footing. Deportation, once a constant shadow, was now far less likely. He could present himself as a naturalized citizen who had served in the armed forces during wartime. When questioned, he stressed that record, pushing his years on the docks and his long arrest history into the background. In the summer of 1944, he left the Army with an honorable discharge, reportedly due to health issues, including heart problems. He returned to civilian life with a small service record, a new first name, and a powerful story. The feared waterfront figure who had worn his country's uniform. For some who knew his full biography, the transformation seemed almost surreal. To him, it was a practical step that strengthened his hand. Back in Brooklyn, the Mangano family still officially ran the territory that included the harbor. Vincent Mangano remained boss. His brother Philip held a high position. On paper, Anastasia was their underboss, second in charge. In practice, his influence sometimes felt larger than that title implied. He controlled access to many piers, directed union figures, and decided which companies received favorable treatment. The union at the center of this world was the International Longshoremen's Association, the ILA. Its leaders had long been criticized for turning a blind eye to coercion and kickbacks. On hiring days, men hoping for work lined up near the piers, waiting anxiously to hear their names called. Those who paid dues to the right people tended to hear their names more often. Those who protested suddenly found their names missing, day after day. Anastasia's power rested largely on that system. He placed trusted men in key union posts. They collected unofficial fees from workers, steered contracts to companies that cooperated, and discouraged anyone who talked to investigators. Shipping executives paid for quiet docks and predictable schedules. If they refused, minor disruptions somehow began. Slowdowns, disputes, cargo that took too long to load. For big firms trying to keep schedules, the cost of paying for labor peace seemed easier than a drawn-out confrontation. Despite this intimidating environment, he began cultivating a more respectable public image. He moved his family into better housing, later acquiring a comfortable home across the Hudson River in New Jersey, with a view of Manhattan's skyline. He married a Danish-born woman, Elsa, who kept a lower profile than he did and raised their children away from the loudest parts of his world. On the surface, he resembled many upwardly mobile immigrants. Nice suit, polished car, children in good schools. Inside his own circle, however, he remained the same, with a quick temper and a talent for using fear. Law enforcement agents continued to link him to unsolved disappearances and sudden deaths among people who had fallen out with the Mangano family. The dismantling of Murder, Incorporated, had removed many of the Brownsville shooters, but violence within organized crime did not end. It simply became more careful, less obvious, carried out with greater attention to avoiding witnesses. Police surveillance reports from the mid-1940s show him regularly meeting with major figures from other families, including Frank Costello, who effectively ran the old Luciano family while Luciano himself lived in exile after deportation. Costello preferred to operate as a businessman, investing in gambling, nightclubs, and legitimate ventures. Yet he understood that in moments of crisis, he needed people around him who inspired real fear. Anastasia, with his record and reputation, fit that need. Their alliance placed him at the center of high-level strategy. When important issues arose, how to respond to government crackdowns, whether to expand into new areas, how to handle ambitious rivals, the same names kept appearing at private meetings. Costello, Anastasia, Vito Genovese, Joe Adonis, and others. Officially, Anastasia owed his loyalty first and foremost to his boss, Vincent Mangano. In practice, he often behaved as if his true peer group were the top bosses of other families. This dual loyalty helped him grow stronger but also planted seeds of future conflict. Mangano, an older-style leader, believed strongly in family lines and clear chains of command. To him, his underboss should not be attending strategy sessions with heads of other families without his knowledge or approval. Yet Anastasia did exactly that. He had been close to Luciano's camp during the Castellammare War, had helped keep the docks in line during the Murder Incorporated years, and now served as a vital ally to Costello. Privately, Mangano complained that Costello and others were encouraging his underboss to act independently. He disliked the way Anastasia discussed plans directly with men outside the family. Rumors circulated of heated arguments at internal meetings. In one often retold story, Mangano and Anastasia quarreled so bitterly that it came to blows, with either the boss or the underboss ending up battered, depending on which version one heard. No court ever confirmed the details, but the tension was real enough that multiple informants later recalled it. While these personal disputes simmered, the entire world of organized crime entered a new phase. The war ended in 1945. Soldiers returned home. Demand for housing, cars, and consumer goods exploded. Black markets shrank as rationing disappeared, but new opportunities opened in construction, trucking, entertainment, and increasingly in illegal gambling and loan sharking. The New York families positioned themselves to take a piece of each development. On the waterfront, peacetime did not reduce Anastasia's importance. If anything, increased trade and rebuilding in Europe meant more ships, more cargo, and more chance for theft or extortion. Crates went missing from warehouses and reappeared on the black market. Insurance fraud schemes multiplied. Some companies quietly wrote such losses into their budgets, rather than risk an open dispute with union figures tied to the Mangano family. Government attention, which had turned outward during the war, slowly refocused on domestic issues. Newspapers began running investigative series on corruption, including the strange power of mob-linked officials and unions. In New York, reform-minded politicians called for inquiries into labor racketeering. Nationally, crime stories drew large audiences on radio and in the new medium of television. This climate set the stage for one of the most important public investigations of the era, the Senate hearings led by Tennessee Senator Estes Kefauver, starting in 1950. Kefauver's committee set out to explore organized crime across the United States. The hearings were broadcast live, bringing the faces of gamblers, racketeers, and suspected bosses into living rooms from coast to coast. For the first time, many Americans saw firsthand the calm, often evasive way such figures handled tough questions under oath. The committee's staff already knew the name Umberto Anastasia. His suspected role in murder, incorporated, his domination of the Brooklyn docks, and his position as underboss of the Mangano family made him a subject of intense interest. They subpoenaed witnesses from the ILA, police officials, and former gang members. Many pointed, directly or indirectly, toward him as a central figure in waterfront corruption. When he was called, he appeared as a well-dressed, composed man with thinning hair and a solid build, far removed from the desperate teenager who had once landed in prison for illegal entry. Photographs from the time show him sitting behind a table, flanked by lawyers, facing rows of senators and reporters. To the public, he looked like a conservative businessman or mid-level executive, not the fearsome underworld figure of police files. His answers, however, revealed little. On the advice of counsel, he invoked his constitutional right not to incriminate himself. Question after question about unsolved killings, union contracts, and company shakedowns met the same careful response. He acknowledged only the most basic facts of his life: his name, date of birth, naturalization. Anything touching his true activities drew a wall of legal protections. The performance frustrated the committee but did not surprise them. Many other witnesses did the same. Yet each appearance had value, even when the person refused to talk. Just seeing someone like Anastasia sitting, under subpoena, in front of a national audience, helped confirm that organized crime was not a myth or a string of isolated street gangs. It was a structured network, with real people at the top. Back in Brooklyn and New Jersey, his prestige rose in some circles after the hearings. To men who lived by codes of silence, his refusal to cooperate with the Senate looked like proof of loyalty and nerve. He had faced the bright lights and refused to bend. At the same time, law enforcement agencies only hardened their views of him. In their eyes, he remained one of the most dangerous figures in the country's underworld, now with even more public recognition. Inside the Mangano family, the strain deepened. The boss resented his underboss's growing national profile. He suspected that Anastasia's closeness to Costello and other outside power brokers meant decisions about the family's future were being made without him. From his side, Anastasia believed his years of service, his control of the docks, and his ability to weather legal storms entitled him to greater respect and autonomy. The two men still met, still attended commission sessions together, and still outwardly maintained the structure everyone understood. But each new disagreement cut a little deeper. The same qualities that had helped Anastasia rise, his readiness to act, his skill at making others fear him, his willingness to serve the broader interests of the commission, now collided with the pride and authority of his own boss. By the end of the 1,940 seconds, that conflict was no longer a quiet undercurrent. Within the world of organized crime, people began to whisper that something would have to give. Either Mangano would find a way to limit his underboss's independence, or Anastasia would push back in a more final way. The Brooklyn waterfront, the Senate hearings, the long history from Tropea to New York had brought him to another turning point, one that would reshape the balance of power in the city once again. By the late 1,940 seconds, Brooklyn's waterfront looked the same on the surface. Ships docking, cranes moving cargo, men in caps, and work shirts crowding the piers before dawn. But beneath that daily rhythm, pressure was building. Umberto Anastasia moved through this world like a man who knew everyone was watching him and none of it could touch him. He had beaten a death sentence as a young man, walked away from the murder, incorporated prosecutions, gained citizenship during the war, and stared down a Senate committee without giving up a word. To many around him, it seemed as if nothing could stop him. Inside his own organization, though, another kind of danger grew. Officially, the Brooklyn family still belonged to its longtime boss, Vincent Mangano. Outwardly polite, old-fashioned in his manners, Mangano believed in a clear hierarchy. He was the leader. His underboss served his interests. Yet in practice, Anastasia acted more and more like an independent power. He had his own connections to bosses in other families, especially Frank Costello. and he made decisions about waterfront rackets that did not always pass through Mangano first. The differences between the two men ran deeper than titles. Mangano came from an earlier generation of underworld figures who valued ceremony, long meals, and careful shows of respect. Anastasia respected some of those customs but placed more faith in immediate results. Where Mangano liked to talk at length, Anastasia preferred a few sharp words and, if necessary, a demonstration of force. Over time, those contrasting styles rubbed against each other. Associates later told investigators about heated arguments. One story, repeated often in police reports, described a meeting where the two men clashed so fiercely that it ended in a physical fight. Different versions circulate. In one, Mangano attacked first and found himself quickly overmatched. In another, Anastasia lost his temper and struck his boss. No court ever established the exact truth, but the existence of such stories shows how far the relationship had frayed. In a world built on discipline and deference, the idea that an underboss might raise his hands to his own leader was shocking. Despite all this, Mangano hesitated to move directly against his powerful deputy. He knew that many of the men on the docks felt more loyal to Anastasia than to him. He also knew that Anastasia had important friends: Frank Costello, then the most influential figure in the old Luciano family, Joe Adonis, and others high in the commission. Going after a man with such allies required careful planning and broad support. Rumors grew that Mangano began talking quietly with Joseph Profaci, boss of a neighboring Brooklyn family, about ways to rein in Anastasia. There were whispers of possible disciplinary measures, even of seeking commission approval to remove him. For his part, Anastasia watched these developments closely. An underworld figure who had survived as long as he did not ignore gossip that pointed toward a move on his life. In April 1951, the long, tense standoff ended in a sudden, decisive way. On April 19, police in Brooklyn discovered the body of Philip Mangano, Vincent's brother and close lieutenant, in Marshland near Jamaica Bay. He had been shot and left there, his car abandoned not far away. That same day, Vincent Mangano vanished. He left his home in the morning and never returned. No remains were found, no ransom notes appeared, no convincing proof of his fate surfaced. From that day forward, he was treated as a presumed victim of foul play, though the exact details stayed hidden. Suspicion fell immediately on Anastasia. He had the motive deep personal conflict with the boss and the means. Loyal followers, access to weapons, control over the very streets where the Mangano brothers moved. Detectives brought him in for questioning. They asked directly whether he had arranged the killing of Philip and the disappearance of Vincent. Calm as ever, he denied involvement. He offered no alternative explanation, simply insisting he knew nothing. In the underworld, few doubted that Anastasia had engineered the outcome, though proof in a courtroom sense never appeared. Within that culture, eliminating a boss without proper authorization would normally be a grave offense, punishable by death. Yet events had unfolded in a way that suggested careful planning. Rather than an open revolt, this looked like an internal adjustment that sought retroactive approval from the commission. Soon after the Mangano brothers were gone, Anastasia went before that body of top leaders. He needed them to accept him as the new boss of the Brooklyn family. To justify himself, he claimed self-defense in the broad sense. According to later accounts, he told his peers that Vincent had been plotting with Profaci and others to kill him, that he had acted preemptively to save his own life. In the world they lived in, where betrayal was common and suspicion constant, this argument carried weight. One key figure standing beside him at that crucial moment was Vito Genovese. Genovese, who years earlier had been a higher-ranking figure under Lucky Luciano, had returned from Italy after the war and wanted to reclaim control of his old family from Frank Costello. To do that, he needed allies. Supporting Anastasia's claim to the Brooklyn family offered him exactly that: a violent, proven enforcer, now in charge of an entire organization. Costello, though wary of upsetting the existing balance, also backed Anastasia. The two had grown close in the post-war years. Costello, smooth and politically connected, liked having a man with Anastasia's reputation on his side. Together, they formed a partnership that some investigators later called a ruling pair over much of New York's underworld business. Costello handling politics, gambling, and high-level contacts, Anastasia handling muscle and labor. Faced with this combined pressure from both Costello and Genovese, and presented with Anastasia's claim that his actions had been defensive, the commission accepted the new reality. He was formally recognized as boss of the former Mangano family. From that point, his organization was often referred to simply as the Anastasia family. Within it, he made a crucial appointment. He elevated a quiet, observant capo named Carlo Gambino to the position of underboss. Gambino, older than he appeared and famously patient, had survived the Castellamarese War by keeping his head down and betting on the right allies. Where Anastasia was explosive, Gambino was reserved. He counted money carefully, listened more than he spoke, and cultivated a reputation for reliability. Bringing him close gave Anastasia a skilled organizer to manage day-to-day business while he maintained his networks and enforced his will. As boss, Anastasia brought the same qualities that had defined his earlier roles: boldness, a short fuse, and a strong belief that fear protected him better than charm. Associates described sudden mood shifts, from relaxed talk to icy anger if he sensed disrespect. Some stories from these years may be exaggerated, colored by later legend, but enough independent recollections agree on the basics. He did not tolerate what he viewed as betrayal, and people who crossed him often suffered swift consequences. One case from the early 1950 seconds shows both his reach and the public outrage his decisions could provoke. In 1952, bank robber Willie Sutton was captured after years on the run, thanks in part to a Brooklyn clothing salesman named Arnold Schuster, who recognized Sutton on the subway and informed police. Schuster became something of a local celebrity, appearing on television to describe what he had done. According to one long-circulating account, Anastasia saw Schuster on TV and reacted angrily, reportedly saying that he could not stand informers of any kind, even those helping the police against non-UMOB criminals. Soon afterward, Schuster was shot on a Brooklyn street by unknown assailants. His killing shocked the city. He had not been part of organized crime. He was a regular citizen, who had done what authorities constantly urged people to do: cooperate. Rumors spread quickly that the order had come from Anastasia, who supposedly wanted to send a message that anyone who helped law enforcement in any case might be at risk. The FBI and New York police investigated, and informants later repeated the story of Anastasia's alleged command. Yet no one was ever convicted for the crime, and Anastasia himself never faced charges on that count. It remained one more dark tale attached to his name, part of a growing stack of suspicions without courtroom resolutions. Under his leadership, the family's activities broadened. Beyond the docks, they pushed into the garment district, trucking, construction, and especially illegal gambling. Bookmakers working under his protection took bets on horse races, sports, and numbers games. Slot machines and other devices appeared in bars and back rooms. In each area, his people collected a share. For protection, for arranging union labor, for smoothing permits and inspections. On the waterfront, the pattern continued much as before, but now fully under his personal authority. Longshoremen still depended on favor to get steady work. Business owners still paid to avoid disruptions. Investigators later documented schemes in which cargo was systematically siphoned from shipments and sold through middlemen, with union and underworld figures splitting the gains. Those who complained often found themselves without work or facing subtle threats. By the early 1950 seconds, this situation drew renewed attention from politicians and reformers. In New York, Governor Thomas Dewey, long a foe of organized crime, supported the creation of the New York-New Jersey Waterfront Commission to clean up the docks. Hearings revealed stolen goods, ghost workers on payrolls, and dock bosses tied directly to men in Anastasia's orbit. The International Longshoremen's Association came under such heavy criticism that it was expelled for a time from the American Federation of Labor. Higher-ranking union officials were indicted. Some went to prison. Despite the wave of investigations, Anastasia again avoided serious convictions. He was questioned repeatedly, watched constantly, and named in reports as a prime power behind waterfront corruption, but few witnesses were willing to testify directly against him. Those who might have could point to a long history of people who had challenged him and ended up dead, missing, or too frightened to speak. Prosecutors built cases against subordinates instead, hoping to chip away at his influence from below. In public, he made efforts to appear respectable. He spent more time at his comfortable home in Fort Lee, New Jersey, overlooking the George Washington Bridge, commuting into the city for meetings, and then retreating to the suburbs at night. Neighbors saw him as a quiet, somewhat stern man who drove fine cars, dressed impeccably, and doted on his children. His wife kept largely to herself. The contrast between this calm domestic picture and his reputation in police circles could not have been sharper. His partnership with Frank Costello remained central. The two men were seen together frequently at Manhattan night spots, such as the Copacabana, slipping into side rooms for private talks. Costello wielded influence with judges, politicians, and business people. He had a talent for making things happen without open threats. Anastasia brought the shadow, the knowledge that if persuasion failed, other methods existed. Together they formed a balance of brains and muscle that dominated much of New York's rackets. Yet this successful pairing alarmed Vito Genovese, who had never abandoned his ambition to control the Luciano family himself. Since his return from Italy, Genovese had quietly rebuilt his own base, gathering followers among younger toughs and discontented figures who resented Costello's relatively moderate approach. To them, it seemed that Costello cared more about high society and steady income than about underworld honor. Genovese promised a return to more traditional ways, with himself firmly at the top. For Genovese's plan to work, he needed to weaken both Costello and Anastasia. Supporting Anastasia's rise in 1951 had been a tactical move, not an expression of loyalty. Now, as the decade advanced, he looked for ways to turn allies against one another. He spread stories that Anastasia's unpredictability might endanger everyone, especially after the Schuster affair and other controversial incidents drew public anger. At the same time, he organized quietly within his own family to undermine Costello's authority. Law enforcement, too, felt new urgency. The Kefauver hearings had revealed the outlines of a national syndicate. Reports circulated among federal agencies naming key leaders in each city. For a long time, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had downplayed the existence of a centralized mafia, focusing instead on bank robbers and communists. But pressure from Congress and the scale of the evidence emerging from New York and other cities began to erode that stance. In this tightening atmosphere, Anastasia continued his daily routine. Meetings with capos, talks with union bosses, dinners with Costello, quiet weekends in New Jersey. Outwardly, the system he and his partners controlled looked stable. Money flowed from gambling, labor, and construction. Problems were handled before they reached public view. Yet beneath that surface, enemies plotted, investigators gathered information, and younger figures weighed whether tying their futures to a volatile leader was still safe. By the middle of the 1,950 seconds, the same pattern that had defined so many chapters of his life repeated itself. Outward control, inward strain. He had survived the docks, murder, incorporated, wartime suspicion, and national hearings. Now he faced a new kind of danger, not from prosecutors alone, but from ambitious men at his own level, determined to reshape the hierarchy once more, even if it meant targeting the man who had so often seemed untouchable. By the middle of the 1,950 seconds, Albert Anastasia lived in two worlds that seemed, at first glance, impossible to connect. In Fort Lee, New Jersey, he was the quiet man on the hill, leaving a well-kept house each morning, driving a high-wind car across the George Washington Bridge, then returning at night to have dinner with his wife and children. He chatted with neighbors about weather and road repairs, sent his kids to good schools, and dressed like a respectable businessman. Across the river, in Brooklyn and Manhattan, his name still carried the weight of dark stories that had followed him for decades. Police reports called him one of the most dangerous men in America. Old-timers on the street whispered about waterfront beatings, vanished rivals, and the long chain of unsolved killings that investigators quietly linked to his decisions. In union halls and shipping offices, the message remained clear, even when no one said it aloud. On the docks, nothing important happened without his approval. As boss of the former Mangano family, he now sat at the very top of that organization. Beneath him were capos in charge of different neighborhoods and industries. Brooklyn rackets, Manhattan gambling, New Jersey construction, Long Island trucking. His underboss, Carlo Gambino, handled much of the daily coordination. Together they managed a broad mix of illegal and semi-legal schemes that touched plenty of ordinary lives in ways most people never saw. Gambling formed one steady source of income. Bookmakers working under the family's protection took bets on horse races, boxing, baseball, and the daily numbers. They operated from back rooms of candy stores, social clubs, and bars, passing money up the chain. In exchange, they received the family's promise that, if police raids came, lawyers would appear. If rival gangs threatened, lines would be drawn. Illegal card rooms, dice games, and betting parlors flourished quietly across boroughs where his men had influence. Loan harking was another pillar. People who could not get bank loans, small shop owners, taxi drivers, gamblers in trouble, turned to lenders backed by Anastasia's crew. The money came quickly, but the interest was punishing. Payments that started as a manageable burden could, over months, become impossible. Once someone fell behind, the pressure increased. Daily visits, stern reminders, then less subtle warnings. Stories spread of people losing businesses, homes, or lifelong savings after falling into that trap. It was not as visible as a shooting, but it did just as much damage to families. Labor rackets remained his specialty. On the waterfront, the International Longshoremen's Association stayed under heavy criticism from reformers and government agencies. Hiring still depended on the goodwill of foremen tied to the family. A longshoreman who spoke against the system could find himself on the beach, passed over again and again for day work, until hunger or desperation forced him to fall back in line or leave the job entirely. Some pier bosses had cozy arrangements with trucking firms and warehouse owners, steering contracts in exchange for under-the-table payments. This basic pattern extended beyond the docks. In the garment district, trucks and loading docks often operated with protection from mobby-connected firms. In construction, certain concrete companies and hauling outfits that paid a share of their profits found bids strangely easier to win. In each of these worlds, Anastasia's family took a slice. Sometimes it appeared as bogus consulting fees or inflated union benefit charges. Other times money simply changed hands in cash, delivered in envelopes in restaurant back rooms. With such a wide range of activities, his financial picture should have been robust. Yet on his official tax returns, he reported very modest income, often describing himself vaguely as an executive or salesman. He claimed that friends lent him money, that his nice house and car were the result of cautious saving, not criminal profit. Federal agents, watching him buy expensive suits, spend freely at nightclubs, and maintain a lifestyle far beyond what his declared income could support, grew increasingly skeptical. By this time, federal prosecutors had learned a lesson from earlier fights with major criminals. When direct evidence of organized violence was hard to obtain, tax charges could offer another route. They had used that strategy against Al Capone in Chicago years before. Now, they turned the same approach toward figures like Anastasia. Treasury agents pored over bank records, insurance policies, property deeds, and any trace of legitimate income they could find, hoping to show that his spending far outstripped anything lawful. In 1954, a federal grand jury indicted him for income tax violations covering several post-war years. The government alleged that he underreported his earnings and lied about their sources. It was a serious case. A conviction could have sent him to prison for a long time and, beyond the sentence itself, would have damaged his standing inside the criminal world. A boss behind bars for tax evasion looked weaker than one who never faced judgment at all. He hired skilled lawyers and approached the case with the same careful stubbornness he had shown in earlier legal battles. His defense emphasized uncertainty. They argued that federal agents could not say exactly how much he had earned, only that they guessed he must have made more than he reported. They pointed to the lack of detailed records in many cash businesses of that era, not only illegal ones, and suggested that the government's calculations rested on speculation. As for his expenses, they produced witnesses who claimed they had lent him money or given generous gifts. The first trial ended without a verdict. The jury could not agree. Prosecutors retried him, hoping that a more focused presentation would sway a new panel. Yet again, jurors deadlocked. Some believed the government's picture. Others felt the math left too much doubt. After 2 mistrials, the case lost momentum. Eventually, in 1957, prosecutors dropped the charges. Once more, Anastasia stepped out of a courtroom with no conviction on his record. To agents and prosecutors who had spent years building the file, it was infuriating. In confidential reports, they wrote that he was practically immune to normal methods. To his associates, the outcome confirmed an almost mystical view that he could not be pinned down. He had beaten a death sentence in his youth, dodged murder, incorporated prosecutions, survived waterfront investigations, sat through Senate questioning, and now slipped away from federal tax charges. Each escape made him bolder in some eyes, more careless in others. The public side of his image also shifted in these years. Newspapers increasingly used dramatic labels when writing about him, calling him the Lord High Executioner or the Mad Hatter. Articles recounted old murder, incorporated cases in lurid detail, describing alleged meetings where he supposedly approved punishments and banishments. Many stories relied on informants like Joseph Valakai, who later testified that Anastasia had been proud of his role as an enforcer, even boasting of it in private talk. Some historians believe these accounts were colored by fear and exaggeration, with each telling making him sound more extreme than the last. Still, there is little doubt that he embraced a reputation for ruthlessness. He knew that, in his world, the idea that he might react violently to betrayal served almost as powerful a purpose as any actual attack. The legend discouraged rivals and kept subordinates in line. Yet it also had a downside. As his public image darkened, other bosses started to worry that he brought too much unwanted heat onto all of them. The Arnold Schuster case was one example. Even though no court ever proved that Anastasia ordered the killing, and some modern researchers question parts of the story, the belief that he had directed violence against a completely uninvolved citizen disturbed many in the underworld. Traditionally, their unwritten rules tried, at least in theory, to limit acts against ordinary people who were not connected to their world. Going beyond that could stir public fury and government resolve in ways that made everyone's life harder. At commission meetings, some leaders increasingly grumbled that Anastasia's temper was becoming a liability. They did not challenge him openly. He remained a formidable figure with a loyal organization, but they began to look more favorably on criticisms coming from Vito Genovese. Genovese argued that the partnership between Costello and Anastasia concentrated too much authority in two hands, and that their high-profile presence in nightclubs, newspapers, and government hearings put a spotlight on operations others wished would stay in the dark. While these political currents flowed, Carlo Gambino quietly strengthened his own position. As underboss, he controlled contact with many captains and handled sensitive negotiations. He was careful never to contradict Anastasia directly, never to show obvious ambition. Instead, he listened, remembered, and cultivated friendships. Other bosses found him easier to talk to than his volatile chief. Over coffee in back rooms, or during long drives to country homes, they got used to discussing sensitive questions with Gambino, sometimes without Anastasia present. Gambino's own background made him a natural bridge figure. He had family ties to Sicily and long-standing connections to Profaci's organization, as well as respectful relations with Genovese's circle. He saw, more clearly than most, how the constellation of power around him was shifting. Costello still held sway, but rivals circled. Federal agencies were devoting more resources to watching top figures. Public opinion, shaped by high-profile hearings and crime stories, turned less tolerant. Gambino understood that a leader who attracted too much attention, or who could not control his impulses, might shorten not only his own career, but also that of everyone around him. Meanwhile, Anastasia expanded his reach beyond New York. According to multiple investigations, his family took a cut from gambling ventures in New Jersey, upstate New York, and parts of New England. He developed ties to casino operations in places like Cuba and parts of Florida through alliances with other crime figures, even if his role was often indirect. Money from those enterprises traveled through a network of couriers, front companies, and coded ledgers, eventually feeding into the shared pools that allowed bosses to finance new schemes. Drugs, particularly heroin, also moved through some channels connected to his world, though he was not known as one of the main architects of narcotics trafficking. Most evidence suggests that he tolerated, and sometimes profited from, shipments that passed through ports under his influence, while others took the lead in organizing large-scale importation and distribution. Still, when federal agents seized heroin warehouses or arrested important dealers, they frequently found ties, however distant, back to the same crime families that dominated gambling and labor. To the public, it all blurred together into a single shadowy network. As the decade advanced, law enforcement confusion about the structure of that network began to fade. Joint committees, police task forces, and state crime commissions compared notes. Names that appeared in New York also cropped up in Chicago, New Orleans, Detroit, and other cities. Even J. Edgar Hoover, long skeptical of talk about a nationwide mafia, grudgingly acknowledged that something larger than street gangs was at work. Confidential memos inside the FBI started referring to La Cosa Nostra and listed men like Costello, Genovese, Profaci, Gambino, and Anastasia as top figures. With that recognition came more surveillance. Agents parked unmarked cars near social clubs, known for hosting high-level meetings. They photographed license plates, followed couriers, and listened to bar talk. Every time Anastasia stepped into a midtown hotel lobby or a Brooklyn restaurant, chances were good that someone, somewhere, was noting the time and the people he met. He had lived under observation for years, but by the mid-950 seconds, the intensity of that watch increased. Inside his family, stories circulated about his mood growing darker. He worried more about betrayal. He questioned the loyalty of some lieutenants. A man who had built his adult life on the ability to see threats before they struck now sensed danger from several directions at once. From prosecutors, from rival bosses, even from veterans of the old Mangano regime, who still quietly resented how their former leader had disappeared. The stress showed in small ways. He demanded even stricter obedience at meetings, cut off men who hesitated when given instructions, and sometimes lashed out over perceived slights. On other days, he seemed almost relaxed, joking with associates, reminiscing about his early days on the docks or his time in uniform during the war. Those close to him learned to read tiny changes in his tone, staying alert for signs that a friendly conversation might suddenly turn hard. By 1956, Vito Genovese felt ready to move against Frank Costello. He framed it as a necessary step for the health of the entire organization, a way to restore tradition and reduce the exposure caused by Costello's public image. Quietly, he arranged support among captains in his own family, reaching out as well to bosses who had doubts about Costello's partnership with Anastasia. In private talks, he hinted that once he controlled his family fully, he would be better able to deal with the problem in Brooklyn as well. This slow, careful plotting would soon explode into the open through a brazen act of violence that shook New York's upper underworld and made headlines around the country. That act, aimed first at Costello, would set off a chain reaction that brought all the tensions around Anastasia into sharp focus. The man who had survived so much the docks, the death sentence, murder, incorporated, wartime suspicion, waterfront strikes, federal indictments, was heading into the most precarious stretch of his life, where enemies inside and outside his world would converge on him at the same time. On a warm night in early May 1957, Frank Costello rode the elevator up to his apartment building on Manhattan's West Side like he had countless times before. He was tired, no longer young, his hair graying, his steps slower, but he still held enormous influence. He handled political contacts, casino interests, and decisions that shaped entire neighborhoods. He also still counted on one man, more than most, to stand beside him if trouble came: Albert Anastasia. At street level, trouble was already waiting. As Costello stepped through the lobby of the majestic apartments near 72nd Street, a figure approached from behind. The man called his name. Costello turned. A gun flashed. One shot rang out in the quiet hallway, the sound echoing between marble walls. The bullet struck him in the head, but glanced along his scalp, rather than entering deeply. Bleeding and stunned, he fell, but he was not dead. The shooter fled into the night. Costello survived, taken to the hospital, patched and bandaged. When detectives asked who had done it, he answered carefully. He claimed he had not seen the attacker clearly enough to identify him. Later, police arrested a young tough named Vincent the Chin Gigante, widely believed to have been the man in the lobby that night. In court, Costello remained consistent. He would not identify Gigante as the shooter. With the victim unwilling to cooperate, the case weakened. Gigante walked free. Inside their world, everyone understood what had really happened. The assault had not been a random act. Vito Genovese had finally made his move. He had wanted Costello's position for years. Now, by sending a message through that Nero-fatal shot, he pushed his rival into retirement without leaving a corpse that might unite allies in anger. Costello read the sign. He was shaken, and no longer interested in risking his life to cling to power. Over the next weeks, he pulled back from daily decisions and meetings. His allies noticed that he stopped pushing his claims as boss of his old family. Quietly, Genovese took over effective control. The organization that had once been Luciano's, then Costello's, now answered to him. For Anastasia, the change was immediate and ominous. His most reliable partner at the top had been badly wounded and had stepped back. In his place now stood Genovese, a man who had helped him gain his own family but who had never hidden his belief that the Brooklyn leader had become a liability. The alliance that had shielded Anastasia in 1951 now dissolved, replaced by a power alignment in which he stood more alone. Tension between him and Genovese had several causes. Genovese disliked Anastasia's unpredictable temper and his public reputation. The Arnold Schuster killing, widely blamed on Anastasia whether accurately or not, had caused anger even among hardened criminals. The idea that a crime boss might order an ordinary citizen killed simply for assisting police against a bank robber, not a mob figure, crossed an informal line. It made the whole underworld look more dangerous to the average voter, inviting more aggressive government action. Beyond that, there were arguments over money. Control of profitable enterprises in places like Cuba, New Jersey, and Las Vegas created constant friction among families. Decisions about who received which share of gambling profits could lead to quiet resentment. Some reports from informants later suggested that Anastasia had tried to assert himself too strongly in certain deals, irritating partners who felt he was taking more than his share. All this gave Genovese an opening. He began quietly arguing to other bosses that Anastasia had become too unstable to remain at the top. He cited the Schuster case, the growing interest of federal agencies in waterfront rackets, and the failed tax prosecutions as proof that constant attention followed the Brooklyn boss wherever he went. He warned that if they did nothing, the government might come down harder on all of them. Genovese was not alone. Within Anastasia's own family, Carlo Gambino had his own reasons to be cautious. He had seen his chief survive case after case by a mix of luck, fear, and clever lawyering. But he had also watched him grow older, more suspicious, more likely to react in anger. Gambino was a patient strategist. He valued quiet growth and long-term stability. To him, a leader who drew too much spotlight and made sudden choices could endanger years of careful work. Over coffee and late-night meetings, Gambino listened as Genovese shared his concerns. The two men had known each other for years. Each understood that alliances at their level were rarely about friendship, and mostly about calculation. The question they considered, in simple terms, was whether the world they dominated would be safer and more profitable. With Anastasia gone, they could not act recklessly. In that structure, eliminating a sitting boss required careful justification and broad support. Without it, those involved risked severe consequences. But circumstances helped them. They could argue that Anastasia himself had broken unwritten rules by targeting innocents and ignoring the need for discretion. They could point to his clashes with the earlier Mangano leadership, claiming this was not the first time he had strained the limits of internal order. According to later testimony from informants and reports from law enforcement, a consensus emerged among key figures. Genovese wanted complete control over his own family and less interference from Brooklyn. Gambino wished to inherit Anastasia's organization without open civil war. Other bosses worried about exposure and shared both men's concerns about their volatile colleague. In that atmosphere, plans took shape to remove him. Who exactly designed the final details remains a matter of debate among historians. Officially, the killing was never solved. No one was tried or convicted. Still, patterns in testimony and confidential reports point toward a collaboration. Genovese providing political cover and outside support, Gambino delivering inside access and knowledge of Anastasia's routines, and gunmen drawn from allied groups rather than from the doomed boss's immediate circle. Meanwhile, Anastasia followed his regular life. He continued meetings with union officials, oversaw gambling operations, and visited Manhattan hotels and barbershops where he felt comfortable. Neighbors in Fort Lee recall that he seemed no more nervous in those days than usual. Years of living under threat had taught him that danger was a constant, not something to brood over. To outward appearances, he remained confident. Behind the scenes, though, he had reasons to be wary. Costello's retreat left him facing Genovese almost directly. Federal surveillance had intensified, He knew that cars sometimes waited outside his favorite spots longer than coincidence explained. In certain conversations, he complained about betrayal and mentioned that he felt surrounded by disloyalty. Whether he suspected Gambino specifically is unclear. If he did, he showed no sign of cutting him off. On the morning of the 25th of October 1957, he followed a simple plan. He went into Manhattan and stopped at the Park Sheraton Hotel on 7th Avenue, a place he liked. On the ground floor, there was a barber shop he frequently used. It was the kind of luxury grooming room successful men chose. Neat chairs, mirrors, polished floors, white smocks, and a calm atmosphere. He stepped inside, greeted the barber, and sat down for a trim. The barber draped a cloth over his chest. Anastasia settled into the padded chair, closed his eyes, and let the day's tensions slip temporarily away. Outside, midtown traffic flowed past, taxis honking, office workers hurrying along the sidewalks. Inside, radio music played. A blade slid along a whetstone. Scissors clicked somewhere in the background. The scene felt ordinary, almost sleepy. Then, in a few seconds, the life he had built ended. Two men entered the barbershop wearing coats and hats. According to witness accounts collected later, they moved quickly, but without shouting. They went toward Anastasia's chair and produced handguns. Shots rang out in the confined space, sharp and repeated, sending barbers and customers diving for the floor. The cloth over Anastasia's chest fluttered, the mirror cracked, bottles of hair tonic fell and shattered. Struck by the first bullets, he tried instinctively to rise, grabbing at the sheet, twisting in the chair. With his vision blurred and the room reflecting in multiple panes of glass, he apparently lunged toward the wrong image, reaching for the empty chair opposite his own, while the attackers continued their work from behind. In less than a minute, it was over. The gunmen turned and left as quickly as they had come, disappearing into the hotel hallway, and then into the city beyond. Staff called for help. Police and ambulances arrived within minutes. Reporters soon followed, drawn by the high-profile name. Photographers captured images of the barbershop chairs overturned, glass on the floor, the white cloth that had covered him now stained and still. Newspapers cleared their front pages. Radio broadcasts interrupted normal programming to announce that one of New York's most feared crime figures had been cut down in a hotel barbershop in broad daylight. Detectives knew immediately that this was no random street crime. The precision, the timing, and the victim all pointed to a carefully planned underworld execution. Yet leads were scarce. Witnesses remembered hats, coats, a sense of speed. No one could provide detailed facial descriptions. The attackers had chosen a moment when they could enter and exit quickly, with only a few seconds of exposure. Soon, theories multiplied. Some investigators looked toward Joseph Profaci's family, whose men had a history of carrying out sensitive assignments. Others pointed to associates of the Gallo brothers from Brooklyn, already gaining reputations as bold younger players. Many in law enforcement believed that the actual shooters came from outside Anastasia's immediate family, precisely to avoid connections that might stand out in phone records or surveillance logs. Above that level, though, suspicion focused squarely on Genovese and Gambino. From a strategic angle, the killing benefited them more than anyone else. Genovese could argue that a major source of unwanted attention was gone. Gambino, as underboss, stood next in line to assume control of the now leaderless family. Informants in later years claimed that both men had coordinated the plan, though each, of course, denied any involvement when questioned. The funeral drew heavy police presence. Officers photographed license plates, noted faces, and tried to match each car and mourner to existing files. Many top figures stayed away, unwilling to appear too close to a man whose death they might have helped arrange or at least quietly approved. Those who did attend often kept their distance, participating briefly before leaving. On the surface, the ceremony looked solemn and traditional. In private, some of the same people expressed relief that a dangerous, unpredictable colleague was no longer at the table. For ordinary New Yorkers, the barbershop scene became a symbol of how deeply organized crime had penetrated the city. The idea that someone could be attacked like that, in a busy midtown hotel, with apparent impunity, frightened many. Newspapers ran diagrams of the shop, published timelines, and reprinted old stories about murder, Incorporated, the docks, the Schuster case, and earlier Senate hearings. Television news, still relatively young as a medium, showed footage of police guarding the hotel entrance and commentators discussing the meaning of the event. Within weeks, another incident in upstate New York would pull these hidden networks even more sharply into the spotlight. In November 1957, dozens of bosses and high-ranking figures gathered at a secluded house near the small town of Appalachian, invited by a local leader named Joseph Barbara. The purpose, by most accounts, was to discuss precisely the kind of issues Anastasia's death had raised: succession, money splits, drug trafficking, and broader policy across regions. State troopers, already suspicious of the unusual flow of expensive cars through the quiet countryside, moved in. They blocked roads and raided the property. Men in suits scattered across fields, scrambling over stone walls, hiding in bushes, only to be caught by officers who could scarcely believe who they were arresting. Among those detained were Vito Genovese, Carlo Gambino, Joe Profaci, and many others long considered mythical by agencies that had publicly downplayed their existence for years. The Appalachian fiasco overturned that denial overnight. Photographs of well-known underworld figures standing in muddy fields, holding hats and covering their faces, ran in papers from New York to Los Angeles. Congressional leaders demanded to know why federal authorities had claimed there was no national syndicate when state police had just rounded up dozens of its apparent leaders in one place. Behind closed doors, J. Edgar Hoover ordered a change in tone. The FBI began talking openly, at least in internal documents, about La Cosa Nostra and listing suspected bosses officially. For Genovese, the sequence of events was a mixed blessing. On one hand, he had succeeded in pushing Costello aside, and apparently, in removing Anastasia. On the other, his presence at Appalachian tied his name unmistakably to the structure he had always tried to keep discreet. Federal agencies intensified efforts against him, personally, eventually building a narcotics case that would send him to prison for the rest of his life. His dream of ruling the American underworld from a secure position faded more quickly than he might have imagined. For Gambino, the moment opened doors rather than closing them. With Anastasia gone, he quietly assumed control of the Brooklyn family, which from then on would often be called by his own surname. He projected an image very different from his predecessors: low-key, cautious, almost invisible to the general public. Where Anastasia had been feared for his temper and dramatic reputation, Gambino preferred to work through patience and careful alliances, avoiding the kind of spectacular violence that drew headlines. Albert Anastasia himself, of course, did not see this new era. His path ended in that barbershop chair in October 1957. Yet his influence did not vanish with him. In the months and years that followed, his name continued to appear in hearings, memoirs, and informant statements as investigators tried to piece together how organized crime in the mid-20th century really worked. Every time someone described the rise of the Commission, the story of Murder, Incorporated, or the power struggles of the 1,950 seconds, his figure appeared somewhere in the background. The former longshoreman from Calabria, who climbed to the top of a hidden empire and paid for it, finally, in the very city he had spent his life trying to control. After the shock of the barbershop killing and the chaos at Appalachian, New York slowly returned to its routines. Taxis still rolled down 7th Avenue past the Park Sheraton. Ships kept coming into Brooklyn and Staten Island. Office workers talked about other things. But for people who had lived and worked in the world Albert Anastasia helped shape, things did not simply go back to normal. On the docks, some longshoremen noticed small changes within weeks. The same pier bosses still handed out work in the mornings. But behind them, different names mattered. Men who had once spoken of Albert in quiet tones now talked instead about Carlo. Everyone understood that Gambino had stepped into the space his former boss had left. Yet Gambino's style was not the same. He discouraged flashy stories and sudden dramatic moves. Where Anastasia's anger could come like a storm, Gambino preferred a low, steady pressure. That difference slowly worked its way through the peers. The old methods of control threats, favoritism, dues, taken from pay envelopes, did not vanish. But they became more careful. Some improvements came from outside pressure as well. The Waterfront Commission kept auditing records and questioning union men. Reformed leaders inside the ILA tried, with mixed success, to push out people linked too directly to the old rackets. For many workers, life stayed hard and insecure. Still, the open fear that had once surrounded Anastasia's name lost some of its edge after he was gone. Inside law enforcement offices, his death marked the closing of one file and the opening of others. Detectives in New York City wrote up their reports on the barbershop case. Witness statements, diagrams, timelines. They listed the crime as unsolved. At the same time, state police and federal agents copied everything they had on him into reference binders that would be pulled out again and again whenever new investigations touched the same circles. The FBI, which had not always taken organized crime as seriously as local authorities wanted, now shifted its posture. Internal memoranda referenced the barbershop killing as an example of what they described as syndicate discipline at the highest level. They started organized programs to track leading figures in each city, giving them labels like top hoodlum and listing their known associates, businesses, and habits. Anastasia's name appeared often in these early efforts, not because they were still watching him he was dead, but because understanding his life helped agents understand how the larger structure had worked. Even as his personal story ended, questions about his last day lingered. Over the years, various accounts emerged from informants, some plausible, some more like rumor. One version named two longtime underworld figures from Joseph Profacy's organization as the actual shooters. Another pointed toward younger men connected to the restless Gallo brothers in Brooklyn. Some said the killers had been promised quick money. Others suggested they believed they were serving the good of the organization by obeying a higher order. None of these stories ever received full legal testing in court. Names surfaced in interviews and confidential debriefings, but by then key witnesses were themselves facing charges or trying to bargain for their own lives. Certain details clashed from one telling to another. As time passed, memories blurred and motives for lying grew. In the end, police never secured enough solid, consistent evidence to bring a convincing case. Officially, the barbershop slaying remained unsolved. Within the underworld, however, most people treated the matter as settled. They accepted that the decision had come from a group of top leaders, with Genovese and Gambino playing central roles. In this world, where very little happened at that level by accident, a daylight killing of a boss in Midtown Manhattan could only have been carried out with high approval. The specifics of who held the guns mattered less to them than the fact that the commission had allowed, or at least not punished, the attack. That acceptance shaped diktat behavior. Younger captains and soldiers absorbed a clear lesson. No matter how feared you were, no matter how many cases you had beaten or how many allies you once had, you were never fully safe if your peers decided you posed more risk than value. Stories about Anastasia's outbursts, his unpredictable decisions, and the controversy over the Schuster case were retold as warnings about letting personal temper outweigh collective interest. For his family, the changes were much more personal and painful. His wife, Elsa, suddenly became a widow in the harshest spotlight. Reporters knocked on doors, telephones rang with questions she did not want to answer, and photographers watched the house in Fort Lee. She had married a man whose work she had never fully discussed in public. Now that shadowed world defined every mention of her name in the news. Estate matters brought their own confusion. Much of her husband's wealth was hidden or tied up in cash businesses. Sorting out which assets could be claimed, which belonged to others, and which might attract government seizure was not simple. Their children grew up with a double inheritance, material comfort from money gathered in rough ways, and a surname that carried a heavy weight. Other kids at school, hearing pieces of their father's story from older brothers or uncles, reacted with a mix of curiosity, fear, and cruelty. Many years later, some relatives would speak about trying to build ordinary lives while carrying a name that reporters still used as shorthand for a certain era of crime. Investigators did not leave the family entirely alone either. Whenever a new case touched the old waterfront structures or Gambino's expanding empire, agents looked to see whether any of Anastasia's immediate relatives had roles in the companies involved. Most of the time, they did not. Whatever else can be said about his private life, he seems to have shielded his closest family members from the inner workings of his organization, keeping them at a distance from direct involvement in crimes. Beyond New York, his death fit into a wider pattern of change. The old Prohibition generation, the men who had built empires on bootleg liquor and violent territory wars, was fading. Some had died in prison or in street shootings. Others had retired to quiet houses, content to draw steady income from businesses they no longer ran day to day. New leaders, born in the early 20th century rather than the 19th, took their places. They tended to think like investors rather than street fighters, even if they kept enforcers on call for special situations. Yet the ghost of that earlier generation remained. In 1963, when federal authorities brought a soldier named Joseph Valakai before a Senate committee, he broke with long tradition by talking in detail about the inner structure of the Italian-American underworld. Under oath, he described the organization he called Cosa Nostra, listing families, titles, and some of the rules that governed their actions. When asked about past leaders, he named Anastasia as one of the most feared men of his time, especially in the years when Murder, Incorporated had functioned as an enforcement arm. Valakai's testimony, together with other investigations, fixed Anastasia's name firmly in the public record as more than a rumor or a headline character. Official reports now spoke of him by rank and family, tracing his progression from underboss to full boss, documenting his appearances at key meetings. In a sense, these late disclosures finally caught up with what longshoremen and local detectives had known, informally, for decades. Popular culture picked up on his story too. Crime books, magazine profiles, and later films drew on his life when building characters meant to represent the old-style tough boss. Writers highlighted details like his origins in Calabria, his work on the docks, the mysterious reversal of his old death sentence, and the dramatic way he died. None of these portrayals were exact biographies, but many borrowed traits that people had long associated with him. Sudden anger, pride in his role as an enforcer, loyalty to certain allies, and a readiness to solve disputes through violence. Some authors and filmmakers stretched the truth, turning rumor into certainty. They wrote as if every unsolved killing from the 1,930 seconds to the 1,950 seconds had flowed directly through his hands, when in reality the underworld involved many other figures as well. Still, the fact that storytellers reached for his name so often shows how deeply he had sunk into the imagination as a symbol of a particular kind of criminal leader. Historians, working with a wider range of documents and a cooler distance in time, have tried to separate what can be proven from what is only likely or merely rumored. They agree on the outlines. A poor boy from Tropea, barely schooled, comes to New York as a teenager. He lands in prison, escapes a death sentence after witnesses falter. He rises on the Brooklyn docks, becomes close to Luciano's camp, and plays a major role in enforcing underworld decisions. He survives Murder, Incorporated prosecutions when Abe Reles dies in that mysterious fall. He gains U.S. citizenship during the war. He becomes underboss and then boss of the Mangano family, kills or arranges the removal of his own boss along the way. He rules through fear, until other leaders decide he is too dangerous to keep. Where debates remain, they often center on questions of degree. How directly did he manage Murder, Incorporated? Did he personally order the killing of Arnold Schuster? Or did that story grow larger in the retelling? To what extent did he cooperate with USC authorities during the war? And how much did that cooperation help him later? How much personal involvement did he have in day-to-day corruption once he became full boss? And how much did he delegate to lieutenants while focusing on higher-level matters? What is clear is that his career helped shape the environment in which later leaders operated. The brutal effectiveness of Murder, Incorporated in its peak years, showed both the power and the risks of centralized enforcement. The way Abe Reles's cooperation and sudden death rocked, that system taught later bosses to avoid creating such visible, traceable units. Afterward, violence did not vanish, but it became more scattered, carried out by smaller teams less likely to form their own identity. His role in waterfront racketeering spurred reforms that outlived him. The Waterfront Commission, born from concern about men like him, continued to monitor hiring, licensing, and shipping contracts for decades. Even in the 21st century, whenever new investigations uncovered attempts to revive old patterns of control on the piers, news articles often trace the roots of those schemes back to the era when Anastasia's word ruled Brooklyn's harbor. His story also underscored a more personal truth about that life: the gap between public respectability and private action. To neighbors in Fort Lee, he was the polite man who waved from his driveway and drove into the city each morning. To fellow churchgoers, he might have seemed serious and reserved. But the choices he made in hidden rooms affected thousands of workers, shop owners, gamblers, and families who never met him. This split-identity family man at home, feared boss in the city would echo in later portraits of crime leaders in books and movies. In time, even some of the men who helped remove him felt the weight of their choices. Vito Genovese, whose ambition had driven the move against Costello and indirectly against Anastasia, ended his days in federal prison after a narcotics conviction. Reports from inside say he worried about informers and paced the exercise yard, watching a world he no longer controlled. Carlo Gambino, more successful in keeping police at a distance, nonetheless spent his life under quiet surveillance. Whenever he met other bosses, teams of agents noted the license plates outside. Neither man could entirely escape the structures and traditions that Anastasia's generation had helped build. They might control them for a time, claim to refine or soften them, but the same cycle of power, fear, and vulnerability ran underneath. In that sense, the barbershop scene in 1957 was not just the end of one man's journey. It was a reminder to everyone in that line of work of how such journeys often ended. For people far outside that world, the longshoreman trying to get steady work, the small grocer squeezed by a loan-shark debt, the immigrant family saving to move out of a crowded tenement, his name eventually faded into background noise, one of many they heard in crime stories. But the effects of the system he served did not disappear so quickly. Only through years of persistent legal pressure, union reform, and changes in the wider economy did the hold of men like him start to weaken. Yet, even as those changes took root, the fascination with his life remained. Writers, detectives, former prosecutors, and even retired gangsters kept returning to his story, trying to understand how a young stowaway from Calabria could climb so far, survive so many close calls, and finally be struck down in such a sudden, almost theatrical way. In their efforts to explain him, they also tried to explain the time and place that had produced him. A century of migration, poverty, rapid urban growth, and weak controls that left space for someone like Albert Anastasia to rise, rule, and fall. Years after the barbershop in Midtown fell quiet again, and new tenants moved into the Park Sheraton under a different name, an old longshoreman walking along the river could still point to certain piers and say quietly, that's where his word was law. Younger men on the docks might only know the name from stories half history, half legend, but the older worker remembered mornings in the 1,940 seconds and 1,950 seconds when a rumor about what Albert Anastasia wanted could change who ate that week and who didn't. By the time those memories turned into tales told over coffee in neighborhood diners, the waterfront itself had changed. New technology, containers, cranes, different shipping routes reduced the need for endless lines of men waiting for day work. Many of the old piers in Brooklyn decayed, their sheds empty or converted into warehouses and tourist spaces. With fewer loose crates and less hand-loading, there was less room for the kind of pilfering and offering books jobs that had once fed whole networks of corruption. The system that Anastasia had helped build did not disappear overnight, but it slowly lost some of its leverage. The Waterfront Commission, born partly in response to the fear he inspired, kept watch over hiring halls, checking the backgrounds of people seeking key licenses. Federal authorities, now more open about tackling organized crime, paid special attention to the unions and companies that had long served as entry points for mob influence. The climate that had once allowed a man like him to rise so quickly no longer existed in quite the same form. Inside offices in Washington and New York, his name turned from an active subject to a historical reference. FBI training materials for new agents used his story when explaining how families, crews, and rackets fit together. Charts showed his connections to Luciano's circle, his role in Murder, Incorporated, his time with the Mangano family, and the way his death cleared the path for Carlo Gambino. For investigators starting their careers in the 1,960 seconds or 1,970 seconds, he was less a living villain than a case study in how deeply one determined figure could shape a city's hidden economy. Those younger agents inherited tools that had barely existed when Anastasia was alive. In 1970, Congress passed the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, a law designed specifically to go after ongoing criminal enterprises rather than single, isolated crimes. Under RICO, prosecutors could show how multiple acts of extortion, gambling, loan sharking, and similar offenses formed a pattern connected to a larger organization. That meant they no longer had to rely so heavily on proving one particular killing or one particular threat. they could build a broader picture of how a family operated. The patterns they tried to show in court often looked very similar to the ones detectives had long suspected in Anastasia's era. Crew bosses collecting street money, kicking portions up to captains, who in turn answered to higher leaders who rarely handled dirty work directly. The difference was that by the 1,970 seconds, wiretaps, undercover agents, and cooperative witnesses made it easier to document those chains. When federal prosecutors eventually brought major cases against the Gambino family and others, they cited activities on the docks, in unions, in gambling that had first come under heavy mob influence in the days when Anastasia walked the piers. At the same time, former participants from his world began to talk more openly, sometimes to save themselves, sometimes out of age and regret. Men who had spent their youth following orders in brownstone clubhouses found themselves years later sitting across from federal agents in quiet rooms, describing meetings that had taken place in the 1,940 seconds and 1,950 seconds. They sketched floor plans of old social clubs, drew diagrams of who sat where at commission gatherings, and gave their versions of decisions that had led to bloodshed. Inevitably, his name surfaced in these accounts. Some described him as a terror, someone whose reputation alone silenced arguments. Others, particularly those who had never met him directly, repeated stories they had heard as young recruits, tales of explosive anger, of sudden punishments, of a man who supposedly bragged about his role as an executioner in the murder, incorporated years. A few, perhaps trying to show nuance, mentioned moments of what they called decency, a time he forgave a minor mistake, or helped a family in need. Even in those softer anecdotes, though, the underlying fear never fully disappeared. Lawyers, judges, and journalists faced a challenge when evaluating all this material. A person who had lived under his command might find it hard to separate fact from myth, especially after decades of retelling. Some witnesses had strong incentives to make themselves look less guilty by making someone else appear more brutal. Others might exaggerate a leader's power to make their own roles seem more important. Sorting through that required patience and cross-checking, looking for details that appeared in many separate sources without obvious motive to lie. In the public mind, however, the more dramatic version often stuck. Crime writers, drawn to extremes, highlighted the harshest stories about him. They described cold winter nights when his car pulled up outside a pier, and local foremen straightened their shoulders in nervous respect. They dwelled on the moment at the Park Sheraton, on the turned-around lunge toward a mirror image, on the heavy symbolism of a man who had ordered so many attacks himself being suddenly vulnerable in a barber's chair. Films inspired by that world rarely used his full name, but pieces of his life slipped into several characters. The underboss who overthrows his own leader. The hot-tempered enforcer who rises too high. The feared older figure whose removal opens the way for a quieter, more calculating successor. Scriptwriters borrowed from Senate transcripts, newspaper clippings, and later memoirs, reshaping events for drama. Viewers who had never heard of Tropea, Murder, Incorporated, or the ILA could still feel echoes of his story in those scenes. Yet beyond the shadow of legend, the plain facts of his life remained stark. Born into poverty in Calabria, he faced a narrow path. Farm work, low-paying labor, or migration. He chose the sea and then the United States, entering the country illegally as a teenager. Arrest and a death sentence came almost at once. From that point on, his days followed a pattern. Survive a crisis by any means. Use the advantage gained to claim more territory. Answer threats with firmness, then with harsher measures if needed. Each step upward cost others dearly. The dock worker killed in the early case that first brought him to the electric chair. Rivals from the waterfront who either disappeared or adjusted their loyalties under pressure. Men marked for elimination in the murder, Incorporated, years when they were suspected of cooperating with authorities. Philip Mangano and his missing brother, the victims of gambling debts and high-interest loans. The families of anyone hurt in union power struggles. None of these people were in a position to tell their side of the story in hearings or books. The contrast between their silence and his enduring fame raises an uncomfortable point about how crime stories are often told. Attention tends to gather around the figure at the top. The boss with the sharp suit, the house on the hill, the reputation that fills a room. Yet the real human cost of that power shows mostly in smaller, less dramatic scenes. A longshoreman coming home with no work because he refused to pay a kickback. A shop owner lying awake at night wondering how to meet a loan payment. A widow trying to raise children after her husband vanished in a quarrel he never fully understood. He was not the only man responsible for such outcomes, of course. Organized crime in that era involved many leaders and thousands of lower E-level participants. But his particular combination of position and personality made him stand out. Where some bosses preferred to stay in the background, talking through intermediaries, he often stepped into conflicts personally. Where others balanced fear with a softer public image, he seemed more comfortable letting his darker reputation show, at least among his peers. Those who study his life have offered different explanations for that. Some point to his early brush with death in the legal system. A young man who has sat in a cell awaiting the electric chair, then watched his conviction crumble, might feel both invincible and constantly under siege. Others note his lack of formal education and the rough conditions of his youth, arguing that he learned early to use force as his main language in disputes. A few suggest that his wartime cooperation with authorities, even indirectly, may have left him feeling he needed to prove his loyalty in extreme ways later. Whatever blend of reasons produced his character, he made choices at every turn. Many people came from similar backgrounds and did not become figures of organized violence. Many longshoremen faced the same harsh working conditions and systemic prejudice and responded by supporting reformers rather than enforcers. Structural factors help explain the world that allowed a man like Anastasia to appear, but they do not erase his responsibility for how he used his opportunities. In that sense, his story illustrates both sides of a familiar theme in American life. On one side, it shows how a poor immigrant, starting with almost nothing, could climb to enormous influence in a few decades, bypassing formal institutions and building his own form of success. On the other, it shows how far from any healthy idea of success that path led. Constant fear, endless suspicion, friends who might become enemies overnight, and an end that arrived without warning in a public place. For law enforcement, the lessons were practical. They saw in his career the danger of allowing whole industries to fall under the quiet influence of a few men. They recognized that going after individual crimes, without addressing the structures that enabled them, only trimmed branches without touching the trunk. In later decades, investigators used those insights to focus on long-term patterns, trying to disrupt the flow of money and the hierarchy that kept it moving. For communities, the lessons were more gradual. Neighborhoods that had once relied on mobby-connected fixers to solve problems, finding jobs, settling disputes, protecting businesses from opportunistic criminals, began to see the long-term price of such bargains. As reforms, legitimate unions, and government services slowly improved, the appeal of turning to figures like Anastasia lessened. It did not vanish altogether, but it became harder to sell the idea that protection linked to fear was the only option. In the end, the boy from Tropea, who had stepped illegally onto American soil, left more than a trail of unsolved cases and sensational headlines. He left a record that forced the country to look more closely at how power worked in its cities, who controlled the ports that fed its economy, who decided which workers got paid, who profited from the casinos and games that flourished in the shadows, and how easy it had once been for hidden leaders to influence unions and local politics. Standing at the edge of the Hudson today, looking across at the towers of Midtown where the Park Sheraton once stood, it is hard to imagine the New York he knew, the smoky bars, the crowded hiring halls, the back-out room meetings filled with men in dark suits speaking in half-sentences. The city has changed. Some of the old tenements are gone. The docks quieter. The barbershops filled with different faces. Yet his story lingers in the background of many others, a reminder of a period when the lines between legitimate business, labor, and underground power were far thinner than most people wish to believe. His journey stretched from a small Italian town overlooking the Tyrrhenian Sea to a hotel chair in the heart of Manhattan. Along the way, he climbed over rivals, survived courts and committees, built alliances, and outlived many who stood against him. For a time, his word on the Brooklyn waterfront could make or break a man's future. Then, in a matter of seconds one October morning, his own future ended in a place where he had probably felt most relaxed, trusting routine to protect him. What remains After the barbershop floor was washed, the hotel renamed, the docks reformed, and the families left to live with what had happened. A complicated legacy. Cautionary tales for those tempted by quick power, hard-won lessons for investigators and lawmakers, and a chapter in the long, uneasy history of how people use fear to gain control and how, sooner or later, that fear tends to turn back on them. And with that, tonight's story from the Silent Empires comes to a close. Umberto Anastasia here, thanking you for walking beside me through the shadows, the power plays, and the silent force that shaped my place in the underworld. If this story helped you relax or drift towards sleep, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and stay with us for more tales of gangsters and forgotten empires. Until next time, may the quiet of the night rest gently over you, and may the echoes of history guide you softly into sleep. Good night.